we again see a few key themes that get repeated from time to time. And these themes are not just patterns picked from case studies. These are structural themes. These are themes that are structurally an outcome of what a platform is. The first theme that we see with any company which is downstream in the value chain is that firms are moving from product centricity to user centricity. In the past, these firms would have competed on the basis of product excellence, on the basis of operational excellence. What happens when the world gets connected is that distribution no longer remains the competitive advantage because everybody has access to the same distribution to some extent. And so the competitive advantage shifts from access to distribution to access to user engagement. And the few companies that can exploit this user engagement emerge as the most successful companies in their respective industries. We've seen this happen in the media industry. The media industry was traditionally and still is a very product-centric industry. And that is why the most powerful person in any media organization is typically the editor, because it was all about editorial quality. What happened with the rise of the internet was the power shifted away from access to distribution to access to user engagement. And so Facebook and Google became powerful even though they did not have the same level of editorial capabilities and actually leveraged content from the ecosystem. So we understand this intuitively in how it applies to media, but this is happening across other industries as well. Retail is shifting to a user-centric model. Healthcare is increasingly shifting to a user-centric model, where eventually in the long run, the few companies that understand the patient really well will win the game and will become the center control points for that entire industry. So if you look at healthcare as an example right now, a whole range of companies are zeroing in to digitize and capture that user data. You have the traditional hospitals coming in with their electronic health records, digitizing the patient's activity. You have new healthcare companies, wearable companies coming in like Fitbit and Jawbone, and they're digitizing wellness data while hospitals digitize cure and intervention data. You have pharmacies like Walgreens coming in and digitizing the purchase of pills, which also gives a pretty good, a very comprehensive picture of a patient's profile, especially if the patient has a chronic condition, because the patient continues to buy pills, and so you can make you can make a very good approximation of what their profile is. And then you have healthcare companies, you have consumer electronic companies like Philips coming in and trying to digitize the test data. You have companies like Apple and Google also coming in after this particular data. So what we're seeing is that in an industry like healthcare, you've got all of these different companies coming in from different industries, all of them after one particular data point, which is the patient's health profile. Because whoever owns that owns the control point on the ecosystem. The same thing is happening in the automotive industry as well. It's happening in the banking and financial services industry as well. And what this repeatedly shows that when you stop thinking in terms of products and move to start thinking in terms of user data, your traditional industrial boundaries do not remain the same. Because your traditional industrial boundaries were based on the kinds of products you sold. Whereas now it depends on what kind of user data do you capture. So companies from any industry can come in and start competing with you. Insurance companies today, for example, has a separate shift, which is that companies today no longer need to rely only on their organizational resources, on their internal resources. They can leverage the ecosystem resources. And this is especially important because when you become user-centric, you realize that you cannot solve all the problems of the user yourself. You can only do what you always did well, because that is what your organization enables you to do. And so if you want to solve all the problems of the user, you need to leverage an ecosystem of partners, which is why the two kind of work hand in hand. There's a feedback loop. The more user-centric you become, the more you need to leverage your ecosystem advantage and bring partners into the mix. Which leads us to a third point, that platforms are converting opaque markets into transparent markets. We saw this happen in consumer markets. So think of TripAdvisor. In the past, the hotel booking market was very opaque. If you were not going to a well-branded hotel, you did not really know what to expect. But TripAdvisor created a reputation model that acts as the decision criteria for you every time you travel. It helps you determine where to stay. And so a whole opaque market was made transparent. The reason this is important for incumbents is if incumbents are to use ecosystem, are to shift from the organizational advantage to the ecosystem advantage, they need to know who to partner with, who is worth partnering with, and who to trust in their ecosystem. And this is what we're seeing now in B2B ecosystems as well. We're seeing the creation of reputation in B2B ecosystems. In the past, B2B transactions, B2B relationships worked on the basis of contracts. And because it was too difficult to find and evaluate a new partner, you would often continue working with the same old partner. But as more and more industries start benefiting, start getting this reputation data about their particular ecosystem of partners, the players in those industries can increasingly start going out and forming new relationships. What changes in a B2B case scenario though is that you won't have social feedback to determine reputation. You won't have businesses rating other businesses. Instead, you will determine reputation on the basis of actual digitized interaction. Whether that interaction is happening over a supplier sourcing portal or whether it is happening over an invoicing application. Every time you use a software application to interact with another business, you're giving data to the platform to help it determine your reputation as a company on a particular parameter, all of which will determine partnerships in the future. Now, once these two things happen, once user centricity works with ecosystem advantage, companies start moving from monetizing promises to monetizing performance and commitment. In the past, what companies would sell was a promise. Every time you sold a product, you were selling a promise. And if the product would work well, the promise would be fulfilled. But today what's happening is companies are increasingly moving away from selling these promises and actually moving to selling commitment and performance. A very well documented example of this is Rolls-Royce and the way it sells jet engines to Boeing and Airbus. In the past, it used to sell the jet engine, which was a heavy investment, a significant investment. And what's happening today is now it's shifted its business model so that it's charging the customers for actual flight time rather than for the engine itself. Now what happens because of that is the moment one company does that in a particular industry, all customers start moving in that direction because the economics work that much better. As customers start moving in that direction, that one company starts getting a really good stranglehold over all of that customer's data. And as that company starts getting more information about the customers, it can become the central point around which all the other partners start aligning. So when you start seeing this happening in a particular industry, you can predict that very soon there's going to be a consolidation in that industry where a few companies will start building platforms and start serving the end customer, and others will start serving these platforms instead. As I mentioned earlier, what's happening because of user centricity is that you're not just selling point solutions, you're not just selling what you used to, you're trying to create an end-to-end service for the user. A very good example of this is Walgreens that I mentioned some time back. So Walgreens figured out that every time users purchased medicines from their store, they were giving them data. And so first of all, it instituted a loyalty program. Think of it as the efficiencies layer. It instituted a loyalty program not just so that you could make more money through more loyal customers, but also because through loyalty, Walgreens now had really good data profile about users. And it figured that users who had long-term chronic ailments gave Walgreens enough data to determine what the exact profile was, where they were in their journey with that ailment, and what kinds of services they would be in need of. And then using this data, Walgreens has now created a third-party ecosystem where third-party healthcare providers come onto the platform and they target these customers. So that's an example of a company moving away from offering just a point solution, just selling a pill, to creating this ecosystem and potentially providing an end-to-end solution. And increasingly, as companies start capturing that consumer data, that digitized consumer data, we'll start seeing more companies moving from point solutions to trying to provide end-to-end solutions. The final thing that's happening with the platform revolution is that we are increasingly moving away from what I would think of as discrete business models to continuous business models. What I mean by that is in the industrial age, we've built a lot of different businesses where we have just a few user touch points and we don't have any engagement in the app. A classic example is insurance. You meet the customer when you want to get the premium, and then you meet the customer when something wrong happens. There's no engagement in between. Events are another example. There's no engagement in between the events. Education is another example. Healthcare is another such example. There is no engagement when the patient is well. The engagement happens when something goes wrong. What we are starting to see in all of these industries is that because of a continuous stream of data, because of the fact that you can continually have data from users, businesses are moving away from these discrete business models to continuous business models. So healthcare is increasingly moving to a patient-centric model where you focus more on wellness than cure, and because you focus on wellness, you can prevent the actual need for cure in the first place. Insurance again is moving to an industry to a model where it's focusing less on trying to monetize the bad event happening and focusing more on creating new value by preventing that event from happening in the first place. Education, with all of this talk about lifelong learning, is also now seeing a lot of activity in the space where different players want to capture the end student's data so that they can serve that student across a much larger life cycle. So in all of these cases, what we see is that connectivity and the fact that you can have this ecosystem of participants allows you to start serving consumers not just at discrete events, but in the gap as well.